This is episode 16 of That Shakespeare Life.
Hi, I'm Nina Mikhaila, historical costumier, tailor, and author of The Tudor Tailor, Reconstructing 16th Century Dress. Another great method for studying the history of William Shakespeare includes listening to this. It's That Shakespeare Life with my friend Cassidy Cash.
You paid a penny and you're allowed to stand there. If you had another penny, and the penny's worth quite a bit back then you would be allowed to go into the galleries, which are built around the walls in 3 tiers on all sides of the theatre. And then you could pay progressively more pennies to get more and more luxury within those galleries until you came to the gentlemen's rooms, as they were called, which were immediately adjacent to the stage itself.
Welcome to That Shakespeare Life with Cassidy Cash. Cassidy believes that if you desire to successfully learn or perform Shakespeare's plays, then understanding the real life and history of William Shakespeare himself is a must. That Shakespeare Life is the podcast that helps you go beyond the curtain of some of Shakespeare's most iconic works and explore the world of early modern England as Shakespeare would have lived it, learning from the writers, historians, and performers who know it best. And now, here's Cassidy.
When we think of William Shakespeare, we almost synonymously think of theater, and it's become very easy for us as a modern audience to assume that our experience of going to see a Shakespeare play in the 21st century is the same as what it would have been like when we went to the Globe in the 16th century. But in reality, the experience of Shakespeare's historical audience is much different than what we have today, from the sights, sounds, technology, and even the concessions that were available at the theater. If we could travel back in time and sit in on the Shakespeare's Globe performance, we would be quite surprised. To take us on just such a trip back in time and visit the Globe as it would have been in Shakespeare's time, Dr. Richard Dutton is our guest today to help us explore the inside of a Shakespeare performance. Richard Dutton spent most of his career at Lancaster University in England and Ohio State University in the United States. His teaching focused on Shakespeare and early modern literature. He has published 29 books in all, mainly on Shakespeare and Ben Jonson, but some other early modern dramatists as well. He has a special interest in the censorship of drama and the editing of plays from the time period. He is currently a research professor at Queen's University Belfast and working on an edition of The Malcontent for the Oxford Marston and revising his own 1991 monograph, Mastering the Revels. This week, Richard joins us to discuss the topic of one of those 29 books, which is Shakespeare's Theatre, A History, by helping us understand what it was like to sit inside one of Shakespeare's performances at the Globe, the sights and sounds you would see or hear upon entering the playhouse, as well as taking an expert look at the variety of theater conventions which were common, popular, and even staples for Shakespeare's staging of his plays, but are totally foreign to us today. When we think of Elizabethan theater, most of us think of a playhouse like the Globe, but in Shakespeare's lifetime, the playhouse was actually a fairly new invention for theater, and a lot of stage performances were done in alternate locations. And if you've ever wondered what types of performance spaces besides the playhouse were popular in Shakespeare's lifetime, then you've come to the right place. Richard, could you help us unpack some of the other performance spaces besides the purpose-built theater that were in use during Shakespeare's lifetime?
Surely, it depends slightly on the date. Up to 1596, there were, within the City of London, 4 city inns where plays were put on very regularly. But somewhere around 1596, those were closed down because they were under control of the city authorities and no longer available for the actors to use. After 1600, 2 boy theatres, children's theatres, reopened. They'd flourished back in the 1570s and 80s, but they were closed throughout most of the 1590s. But they reopened and they were using indoor theatre spaces. One of them, the Blackfriars Theatre, which Shakespeare himself was to use after 1608. But those were the only kinds of theatrical space available other than places like the Globe and the Theatre and the Curtain, playhouses of that kind in the 1590s. The only other kinds of places in London you might be able to see Shakespeare and his fellow actors would be in privileged contexts like the law schools, called the Inns of Court, where they are performed occasionally, and at the royal palaces, where they performed quite regularly in what was known as the revel season. That's over Christmas and through to Shrovetide, just before Ash Wednesday. But of course, to get into either the Inns of Court, and even more so the royal palaces, you had to be very well connected. Okay, so there were those places. Outside of London, it's a different pattern altogether. There are no standing theatres outside of London. Well, there's some question about whether there was one just outside Liverpool. But leaving minor queries aside, there the actors earned their living by travelling around the country. And when they did that, they made their money either by going to the great houses, usually friends of their patrons, who would give them a gratuity of some kind for performing for them there, or if they went to one of the cities, they would call upon the mayor or the chief officer of the town, and they would give the mayor a performance in the Guildhall or the Town Hall or whatever it was called, and they would get a gratuity for that. They weren't actually taking money at the door or anything, but then they would really top up their money because the mayor would then give them permission to make a number of performances within the town or city itself, and that would be at one of the local inns, parallel in many ways to the kinds of inns that they would have known from London as well. That just about covers, I think, all the regular forms of playing house that I can think of from the period.
Which makes me think that theater and performance were readily available there in London, and I'm going to call it thereabouts, because you mentioned that there was a slightly different theater culture, whether you were in the city proper or not. But when Shakespeare and Burbage worked together to relocate the Globe, which was, I believe, the theater, and then they moved it across the Thames to make the Globe in 1599, with so many options really for playwrights to put on plays and so many places and ways that they could do it. Why was it worth it to Shakespeare to go to that great of a length to move that entire building under difficult, circumstances? Why was it so important to do that?
Oh, it was rather critical. The way I've just run off that list makes it sound as though there were a lot. But in practice, there were only ever about 4 or 5 of those amphitheatres like the Globe available to actors at any one time. And if you were going to be performing continuously in London, you had to have control over one of those. That's a new thing that opens up in the 1590s. Prior to that, all performers toured, but London becomes a viable context in which you can be performing year-round. A company called Strange's Men tried out in the early 1590s. Shakespeare's company is one of the first to make that work. And the problem that they met in 1597 was that their landlord, the man who owned the land on which the theatre was based, refused to renew their lease. This put them in a critical position. They were able to use a neighbouring theatre called the Curtain for a time, but this was old and not really very satisfactory. Also, technically, the man who owned the lease actually technically owned the theatre itself once it was left beyond the end of the term of the lease. That's why it had to be done as dramatically as it was. Basically speaking, the Burbage brothers, who really owned the theatre, was actually technically Cuthbert Burbage, the elder brother, but they always worked together. who owned it, they saw their entire investment, as it were, in danger of going down the tubes.
So they were saving it on a technicality. They were getting in under the wire of the owner.
They were stealing what had been their property. The leaseholder took them to court afterwards, but never got anywhere with it. But of course, those, particularly the big oak beams which formed the inner structure of the theatre were phenomenally expensive kinds of things to have. And so it was worth their while to pull them all down and ship them out across the River Thames and to rebuild them in this site in Southwark, because otherwise they wouldn't have had a permanent playing place.
Well, in addition to their massive innovations with the repertory theater that you mentioned, one of the things I'm always impressed with William Shakespeare about was that he could take the same play and put it before Queen Elizabeth or the court of James I, and it would be just as successful there as it was, in a playhouse for the general populace. It's the same play. And I wanted to ask you, wouldn't the content of the play need to be different if you were performing before the Queen of England? Wouldn't you do something different than if you're, performing for the people that regularly visit a playhouse? That's an entirely different class of people.
Well, it is a different class of people, you're right, though I would argue that basically, given his situation, Shakespeare and his fellows started with their, as it were, attachment to the Queen or then the King and their patrons, whoever they might be. And they, as it were, then served the paying population as best they could, because basically speaking, without royal approval, without the license that gave them, they wouldn't have been allowed to perform anywhere. So that's one part of the equation. I personally believe, this is not universally held, that actually Shakespeare probably did revise some of his plays with a particular view to them being performed at court. In fact, the book I wrote before the current one is actually about that. And that this explains, for example, why some of the versions of some of Shakespeare's plays that we have are amongst the longest plays ever written in the period. And I think the only place it's realistic for them to have played would have been at court, because when they were at court in those royal palaces, it's the middle of winter, and those aristocrats enjoyed staying up into the dead of night. The plays would begin about 10 o'clock. They went on to 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning. Therefore, you needed substantial plays, longer than in practical terms could be put on in the afternoons in the city theatres. So in those kinds of ways, I think Shakespeare was capable of expanding his plays in order to, as it were, fit the needs of royal theatre. Or he was able, obviously, to scale down and produce something that worked within the globe or wherever else we're talking about at the time.
Well, let's pretend we are one of the general populace for just a moment, and we're walking into the globe. Help us understand what this experience would be like, first by telling us, where would we sit?
Well, unless you're very well off, you probably wouldn't sit at all. About half of the entire audience stood in what was called the pit, immediately underneath the stage. You paid a penny and you were allowed to stand there. If you had another penny, and the penny's worth quite a bit back then you would be allowed to go into the galleries, which are built around the walls in 3 tiers on all sides of the theatre. And then you could pay progressively more pennies to get more and more luxury within those galleries, until you came to the the gentlemen's rooms, as they were called, which were immediately adjacent to the stage itself. And they were pretty luxurious by the standards of the day. And then there's one even more dramatic place that you might go, and that's to one of the Lord's rooms. Now, the Lord's rooms were set into what's known as the tiring house, the place where they kept the props and their costumes, and from where the actors appeared on stage. In the upper level of the wall of the tiring house were these Lord's rooms, from which people who were prepared to pay 12 pennies for a seat, and that really was quite a lot in Shakespeare's day, were able to look down, as it were, on the performance, but also be seen by everybody else in the theatre. It was a very privileged position to be sitting up there, and they had a private entrance that they could get in through the tiring house, and people who were sitting up there obviously hobnobbed with the actors backstage, very much the way sort of London theatre and New York theatre still does it today.
Which is an interesting comparison, as the next question I guess I wanted to ask you about was when we make a lot of comparisons between theater today and Shakespeare's theater when he was performing it in the 16th century. But in his book, Richard dedicates one of what he calls the box stories to Johann de Witt, and the story of how de Witt visited London and saw Julius Caesar performed on stage. In that story, de Witt outlines the experience of attending a Shakespeare play, and he describes a trumpeter that would announce the show at the start, which is very different from what we think of today, where we have the lights dimming and a hush falling over the audience, and it being a very quiet experience. Someone playing a trumpet is quite loud. And Richard, that example seems so contrary to our theater experience today. And I wanted to ask, what else would someone who is visiting the globe see or hear as the play was about to begin that might be different from the way we experience plays today?
Yeah, surely. Well, the first thing, of course, is if we are talking about the globe, it's the open air, and it's not the evening, it's daytime. Performances from the 1590s onwards started at about 2 o'clock. And so, if you're lucky, it's a sunny day. If you're not lucky, and if you're in the pit, you're being rained upon. That's a totally different kind of experience from what most of us know most of the time about theatre. I think in terms of your senses as you go in, visually, one of the things you'd be struck by about the theatre is that it was very brightly painted. It's not drably uniform or whatever. They were actually trying to imitate what they knew of Roman theatre from the literature that the Romans left behind. And they would even paint the pillars holding up the so-called heavens over the stage to look like marble, for example. And then the heavens themselves were painted with astronomical and astrological signs, in blue and gold overhead. So visually, it's a very striking place to enter. In terms of smells, what would you smell? Well, I think the first and worst thing you'd smell is everybody else in the theatre, because the Elizabethans didn't believe in bathing. The smells would be pretty grim, I think, by modern standards. So, of course, they would be used to that. But nevertheless, people at least rich enough to do it would carry what they call pomanders, which would be full of scented material, which you'd wear close enough to your nose to keep other people's smells away. But I'm never sure how successful that might be. You'd also smell probably food. There would be hot food available somewhere from concession stands within the theatrical space, within the pit, presumably. So it would be a rather dubious mix of smells you'd be faced with. As for sound, yes, I mean, that trumpeter was actually up in a turret at the top of the theatre, so it wouldn't have disturbed the audience too much, I don't think. That trumpeter was mainly there to tell the people in London there's a show about to go on, and he would blast his trumpet 3 times progressively closer to the beginning of the show. And the last one would let everyone know this is when it's supposed to start. Whether that would actually shut them up is a good question. Yeah, it's clear that sometimes, Shakespeare was aware of this, and there would be music from the very beginning. Yeah, you think at the beginning of Twelfth Night, if music be the food of love, play on. Obviously, somebody's playing there at that time as he's speaking. That's not a trumpet blast. That's presumably lutes and recorders and things like that. But it's very striking how often Shakespeare, say, has royalty enter very early. And when royalty entered, the trumpets blew. You would have fights, the trumpets would blow and drums would be drummed. There's a lot of noise, as it were, coming from the stage, part of which is clearly aimed at keeping the audience focused and reasonably quiet.
Well, besides the lights not dimming at the start of a production, and obviously the theater experience not necessarily being the quiet one we think of today, Richard also writes about how Elizabethan plays would conclude with a dance or a jig to signal the end of the play, acknowledging with this quote, "These are alien conventions to us, hard evidence that the past really was a foreign country and they did things differently there." Richard, please help us navigate this foreign country a little bit and explain why plays concluded with a dance. I don't think that does typically happen today unless the theater company's, sticking pretty strictly to historical norms. Then why was this convention used in the first place? What purpose did it serve for the playing company to wrap up the play with a dance?
Well, it's a good question, and we don't know the answer to why. The jig is a little easier to bet. Yeah, jigs were sort of bawdy and irreverent little playlets, and they seem to have been put on after a regular show, as a kind of special way of sort of giving the audience an extra treat. And they were things that the audience looked forward to in themselves.
So sort of like the little skits that might show up after the credits in a film?
Well, that sort of thing, possibly. I mean, a more formal precedent might well be the kind of satire play that was put on when the ancient Greek drama was performed. We often forget that those great Greek tragedies were put on in a cycle of 3 at a time, and then there'd be a satire play, a very rude, very bawdy comic episode, as it were, to round it all off. Whether I don't know that there's any evidence that the Elizabethans even knew about them, but possibly some kind of folk tradition of such things carried through to the jig. But Shakespeare's company gave up jigs in 1599. We can pin it quite precisely, because the real master of the jig, Will Kemp, left the company then almost certainly because they'd changed policy when they moved from the theatre to the Globe. That was 1599. It seems that the new policy they were pursuing at the Globe didn't want anything as bawdy and irreverent. And it looks as though the dances may have come in as a kind of politer alternative, but still something that left the theatre audience with a kind of upbeat feel at the end, re-energized, or however you'd want to put it. But it's kind of speculation as to why they did it. All we really know is they did it.
Well, after the dance or the jig, playing companies would host prayers for the Queen or for the Lord Patron. Shakespeare uses this convention in Henry IV, Part 2, when a dancer gives an epilogue that includes kneeling to pray for the Queen. Would the entire company kneel to pray at the end of a production, or just a single character?
I think, and this is more guesswork than anything else, I think everybody who's on stage at the time would. Now, whether the entire company would have been out there at that point, as you say, we get a record of this specifically at the end of Henry IV Part 2, but that seems to be a chorus. He's there with other dancers, so the dancers might have got down, but that wasn't necessarily the whole company. But I think everyone who's on stage would.
Why was this, and I guess I shouldn't ask why was it part of the play, but these weren't telling morality tales or trying to be religious with their performance necessarily. In fact, playhouses were often targets of criticism by groups like the Puritans, who saw the theater as pulling people away from divine service. So I felt like this was particularly surprising as a theater convention from Shakespeare's time for them to have added a prayer. Was this a holdover from some of the morality plays from before, or was this something they included at the request of the reigning monarch?
Oh, I think this goes back to what I was saying earlier about the way everybody understood their position in this society and the way the actors understood the way that they were licensed to perform at all. This is a way of showing their gratitude either to their patron or to their patron's patron, i.e. the Queen or the King. This was their way of showing their humility, showing that however much they were allowed to show their talent, it was always at the will and behest of their betters.
Now, Shakespeare was hardly the only person performing plays during this time, so I want to ask about another prominent theater owner, Philip Henslowe. He built the Rose, and Richard writes about Henslowe's approach to running a theater, being a conduit for some ancillary businesses, including a concession stand and a ferry business where he would take people back and forth across the river to and from seeing the plays. Richard, can you explain to us this entrepreneurial side of a theater business? Was Henslowe innovative in this way, or was that just part of running a theater to have these extra side businesses going on attached to it?
Well, the only real evidence we have on this is the kinds of partners that the men who built the theatres took on. When James Burbage, the father of Richard, built the original theatre with a capital T, he brought in his brother-in-law, who was a grocer. And that's a pretty good sign that someone was going to handle the food stalls, as it were, side of things. In fact, they fell out and went to law against each other quite extensively. But clearly, from the very beginning, people saw, theatre was a way of making money, and it made an awful lot of money for some few people. And the main people it made a lot of money for were shrewd entrepreneurs like Henslowe. And we just happen to know a lot more about Henslowe than we do about really any of the others, because his papers have survived. They're kept at Dulwich College, which was founded by Henslowe's own son-in-law, a great actor called Edward Allen, who founded Dulwich College and left their joint papers to it. So we can see something of Henslowe's business methods. He was a money lender, but basically he made his money from the theatre initially out of getting a fixed proportion of the take at the box office, and by whatever other kinds of ancillary activities he could put on to add extra money. And he was very, very successful at it.
Earlier, you mentioned there were concessions and hot food available to the people who would be, consuming food while they were watching the production. And I have to ask, if they were armed with food, did the audience ever throw food at the performers? I've seen this done in jest in films that portray early modern theater. And I wondered if there was any historical precedence to this idea that the audience would get angry and toss their tomatoes at the actors.
Well, one thing one can say is it wouldn't have been tomatoes. because, tomatoes, as we Brits would call them, were native to America, and the early Europeans in America thought they were poisonous. So there were no tomatoes in England at this time. But did they throw anything else? Strictly speaking, I don't think we know whether they threw anything. We know that if they didn't like what was going on stage, they could get very rambunctious indeed. Ben Jonson's Two Tragedies, for example, Sejanus, put on in 1603, and Shakespeare was acting in it at the time, and then Catiline in 1611. Both of those plays were hissed off the stage in their first performances and not put on again for some considerable time. So, audiences were not polite. It wasn't that they just walked out if they didn't like it. No, they could get very vociferous. But throwing things, I don't think we have any evidence on.
Well, even with all of these details that you've shared with us, I feel like we've only scratched the surface of not just this topic, but even the ones that you've shared in your book. It's just a fraction of what we could talk about on this topic. And before we wrap up today, I want to just ask you if there is any one thing we may have not addressed yet that you would not want us to miss when we think about what it was like to visit a real 16th century performance of Shakespeare.
Well, I think the elephant in the room, if you like, that we haven't mentioned anything at all about, of course, is there were no women on stage. All the women's roles were played by boy actors. And that is a totally alien convention to us today. I know people attempt to do it from time to time, but when we do it, it's different because we're used to seeing women on stage. Shakespeare's audience weren't used to seeing women on stage. It just didn't happen. And then you can ask me, why didn't it happen? And we don't know. It wasn't that there was a law against it. I mean, you probably remember the movie Shakespeare in Love, where Gwyneth Paltrow does appear in Romeo and Juliet, and they have this officer, the master of the revels, going to shut them down for allowing a woman to perform on stage. But there were no rules about this. There were certainly no laws. There may have been understandings, but there were no given laws against it. But for whatever reason, the actors chose to continue, using boys that they trained up themselves. And so anyone watching a Shakespearean play must have been intensely aware of how artificial it was. However good the actors were, however naturalistic they were, there was always going to be something strange, something possibly disturbing about boys pretending to be women. There were certainly plenty of Puritans around to condemn that as a practice. They thought it was bad for the boys and bad for the minds of at least certain men in the audience.
Well, this topic is one that is definitely worth exploring further. And to that end, we would like your recommendation. In addition to your book, what are a few titles you might recommend, or ones that you even found most valuable as sources when you were writing your book to explore this idea more?
Right. Well, this is, I could go on all day about this. Let me talk about early sources. I was talking about Henslow's papers. Henslow's diary is one of the absolutely essential sources. It might not be easy for someone who's not used to reading Elizabethan script because there is no modernized version of it available, but it's something that anyone who really wants to understand how the acting companies operated needs to get their heads around. And similarly, there's a book called The Control and Censorship of Caroline Drama. Caroline, that's from the age of Charles I. Now, that's later than Shakespeare, but it's the earliest evidence we have of the way that man I just mentioned, the master of the revels, censored and licensed these plays. You have to remember that every time Shakespeare was putting on one of his plays, he had to have a license on it. And if the censor didn't like anything in it, it would get cut out. So those two books are really crucial to understanding the nature of the kind of world that Shakespeare lived in. And one of the great compendiums of information about Shakespearean theatre. It's nearly 100 years old now. E.K. Chambers' The Elizabethan Stage, which came out in 1923. There are lots of bits of it that are dated now, but basically as a compendium of just about everything you could imagine necessary to know about Shakespeare's theatre, there's a very sensible version of it in Chambers. Are we running out of time? I could go on to talk about modern books as well, if you like.
Sure, yes.
Okay. I mean, if anybody's interested about theatre at the court, they should see John Astington's book called English Court Theatre. If anyone's interested about the audiences in Shakespeare's day, they should see Andrew Gur's Playgoing in Shakespeare's London, which has gone through at least 3 editions now. Indeed, anything by Andrew Gur is going to be worth reading. One book that's really quite recent, it only came out last year, but if you're looking for sort of small chapters on any one aspect of these questions, I'd recommend A New Companion to Renaissance Drama, which is edited by Arthur Kinney and Thomas Hopper. But it does have an essay by me in it, but that's not why I'm recommending it. It's actually quite a good compendium. I could go on and on, but...
Those are fabulous sources and definitely a good start for us to read and explore this further. Well, what's next for you? What are you working on now that you're excited about?
I'm working on 2 things at the moment. One is I'm doing an edition of a play called The Malcontent, which was written by a man called John Marston. It was originally written for one of the Boy companies, but in 1604, Shakespeare's company stole it and adapted it to put it on at the Globe in a slightly different version. And so editing this, it's for a complete works of John Marston, is for me a fascinating experience looking at another aspect of the mechanics of putting on these plays. And the other thing that I'm working on, a slightly longer term project, is I'm revising one of my own earlier books. It's a book called Mastering the Revels, which is all about those individuals, the masters of the revels, and the way that they licensed and censored the plays. That came out in 1991, and so much work has been done on censorship in the intermean that I figured now I'm retired, this is the time actually to bring it fully up to date. That'll keep me going for a couple of years.
Well, this has been a fascinating conversation and a wonderful trip back into 16th century theater and getting to walk through the globe with you. Dr. Dutton, we appreciate you being here today and sharing your expertise with us. Thank you so much.
It's been a great pleasure, Cassidy. Thank you.
If you would like to see a visual illustration of what the globe looked like with the pit and the tiring house that Richard talked about, you can visit the show notes for today's episode, where you'll see a place to sign up for the email list. That lets you get weekly notifications about new episodes and free artwork once a month. For joining as a listener of today's episode, you can immediately download a hand-illustrated diagram of the inside of Shakespeare's Globe Theatre when you subscribe. Visit castycash.com/episode 16 to find out more. That's castycash.com/EP16. Artwork that I create for the email list is included inside an entire resource library that's a benefit of becoming a patron of That Shakespeare Life. Each episode we do here is supported by listeners just like you who want to learn about Shakespeare and enjoy learning with friends. To become a patron of That Shakespeare Life, visit castycash.com/join to find out more. That's cassidycash.com/JOIN, where you can check out all the Shakespeare fandom, resources, and community we have there just for you. Until next time, I'm Cassidy Cash, and I hope your week is a Shakespeare-filled week.
Thank you for listening to That Shakespeare Life. As always, the best conversations happen after the episode over at CassidyCash.com. Become a part of a vibrant Shakespeare conversation by adding your voice over at the website. Until next time, remember, when you want to know William Shakespeare, you have to go behind the curtain and into that Shakespeare life.